Inclusivity for trans and non-binary students. My name is Amy Shatila. I'm a specialist in school psychology, credentialed in California. I'm also a nationally certified school psychologist, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I work with Psych Services, and I wanted to tell you just a little bit about who we are before we get started so you'll know where I'm coming from. We are a team of learning and behavior experts, and we're passionate about supporting schools. We see so many schools trying to do so much with too few resources, and we know there are a lot of pieces to that puzzle, whether it's meeting the increasing demands on campuses, staying up to date on the legal guidance, learning evidence-based interventions, and we don't want you to feel like you're alone in your journey to help the students. And so at Psyched, our goal is to lighten the load by giving you helpful tips and tools in this webinar, and also providing high quality services, resources, and supports that go beyond the webinars. So we partner with districts for assessments, services, and behavior consultation. And we also offer coaching and support, school psych intern supervision, and trainings. So that's just a little bit about us. But let's jump into gender inclusivity. Okay, first let's talk about the law. I think that it's good to have a basic understanding of the framework of the law as we discuss inclusivity and equity, so we can really understand the importance. We're going to start with federal guidance. First, we have Title IX. So Title IX is a federal law. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender or sex, as well as other things. Title IX is often cited in lawsuits related to gender, and is a foundational federal law for equity cases. The other important federal guidance to note is the Equal Protection Clause from the 14th Amendment. And it states that no state will deny any person the equal protection of the laws. And that this is also a very commonly cited clause in cases related to gender equity. So we know that federally there are some broad protections. Let's look more specifically at California laws and legal guidance. We're pretty lucky. California has some of the most robust laws protecting gender equity in the country. So that's great. So there are a lot of more in-depth documents. I'm just going to highlight some key things that apply to us in the educational setting. There are hyperlinks throughout this, and you will have access to a PDF of this presentation. So you can feel free to do a deeper dive later if you would like to read more of the background and details for these kind of broad strokes that I'm going to review. So first we have the California Education Code, which also prohibits discrimination based on gender, gender identity, gender expression, and prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender for enrollment, counseling, PE, athletics, generally all the things that a student might want to participate in related to education. Many of you are probably familiar with AB 1266, which gives a lot more detailed guidance. One of the highlights and things that is often mentioned is the part that talks about students being permitted to participate in sex-segregated school programs and activities and to use facilities consistent with their gender identity. That's regardless of what gender is listed on their records, they are permitted to participate in the programs, the activities, and use the facilities with that's congruent with their gender identity. So those are two important things to note. There's obviously a lot more to that, but those are kind of the broad overviews for that. Okay, some additional California guidance related to name and gender. The California School Board Association has put out this guidance document, and one of the things that is really highlighted there is that districts should ensure that all staff use the name and pronoun that is preferred is the language that they use, but I would say that the student identifies with for a trans or gender nonconforming student, and that on request they should prepare the data systems that to list that student by their name and gender that they associate with. So note that it doesn't say with legal documentation or, all of these different requirements need to be fulfilled. It's at the student's request. And so additionally, they recommend against requiring medical or mental health diagnosis or treatment in order for a student to have their gender identity recognized. This is really important because it's not appropriate at all to ask for any kind of diagnosis, nor do many students who are gender nonconforming or trans have a medical or mental health diagnosis, because just because a person is trans or gender nonconforming in no way would suggest that that person would have any kind of mental health diagnosis or medical diagnoses. So definitely don't request that. And some of the documentation that's explicitly noted in this guidance document to change and update include attendance sheets, school IDs, and report cards. And we're going to talk about why that is. We want to maintain confidentiality for our students. And so I've listed 3 different laws in Ed Code that reference confidentiality. Essentially, both on the state and the federal level, it's very, very clear we cannot disclose students' information and their education records. We can't share about their lives, right, without their permission, not the family's permission, but the student's permission. And so we need to remember that. And so part of that includes, if you don't update records for a student, let's say the student uses different pronouns and presents as male, but their records indicate that they are female, and you don't update things in the system, you may have situations where their privacy and their history of being identified as another gender previously are accidentally disclosed, which would breach confidentiality. Here's a reason why this is so important. Here's some statistics from 2018. I do want to note a couple of things. These statistics came from before the time of COVID, so this reflected responses from students that were receiving in-person learning, and it also used kind of a broad umbrella, and so they did have non-binary and gender non-conforming students respond to this this survey, but they all kind of were included under the trans umbrella. So that's important to note. I'm going to go through these stats because I think they need to be said aloud. 90% of trans students have heard derogatory remarks sometimes, often, or frequently at school, and 89% of trans students have reported being verbally harassed at school. 55%, so over half of trans students, have been physically harassed in school. And so, unsurprisingly, almost half of trans students have skipped a class, or a day of school in the past month because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable. So thinking about that and how pervasive bullying and harassment is for our trans and gender diverse, gender non-conforming population, it's really important that we do whatever we can to maintain confidentiality and show them that we honor them as people. And also to try to make sure that we can decrease chances of them being, quote, outed, which could lead to harassment and bullying. Okay, so now that we've gone through the legal and kind of the grim statistics of what many of our students are experiencing on a regular basis, let's backtrack just a little bit to make sure that we're all on the same page and understand gender. First, sex and gender are different. They used to be used kind of interchangeably, but they are very different things. So sex is based on genitals and is assigned at birth, right? So male, female. We know that there's a larger spectrum than just male and female, but most people are born with male or female genitals. And then gender is presumed based on that. So gender reveal parties, the sonogram shows either male or female genitalia, and then, oh, it's a boy, it's a girl, right? We don't know yet how that tiny human is going to identify. We're just making an assumption. So when the assigned sex at birth and the gender match, that's considered to be gender congruence. So I'm going to use myself as an example. I am genetically female and I identify as female. So that would be gender congruence. We know that that's not always the case. Many people, their gender does not match their assigned sex at birth. And so those are the people that we're talking about when we have considerations for gender equity. Okay, I wanted to share with you this gender unicorn. I think it's an absolutely wonderful graphic. It's from Gender Spectrum, created by TSER. It's a free resource. You can just Google gender unicorn. But you'll see there's several different aspects to gender. So there's gender identity. So again, using myself as an example, I'm a female and I identify as a woman. And then some people identify as male, man. Some people identify in other ways. We'll go over that in just a bit. But understanding that there's more than two gender identities. Separate from gender identity is gender expression. And there have been a lot of stereotypes that have been pretty pervasive throughout the years and that still persist related to gender expression. So if you think about femininity, masculinity, and all the cultural things that are tied to that, that may or may not have anything to do with that person's gender identity. And like many things, gender expression changes over the lifetime sometimes. If you think about how feminine or masculine, some people are kind of expressing themselves on kind of a diverse way, and none of these have to be static. So the third is sex assigned at birth, which we've already talked about. The fourth and fifth are who we're attracted to. So who people are physically attracted to and who they're emotionally attracted to. I encourage you to go to Gender Spectrum or Google Gender Unicorn and check out this graphic. There's also some more explanation on the bottom half of the graphic that gives you a little bit more. And it's a kind of nice thing to have. Tack it up on your wall or just save it on your desktop if you're not already familiar with these different dimensions of gender, to kind of help yourself remember the different aspects of gender. Okay, so very briefly, child development is obviously very complex. There's lots of research around it and lots of research around gender identity. But just to really briefly touch on it, the American Academy of Pediatrics has stated that by age 4, most children have a stable sense of their gender identity. Many children by the age of 2 are already starting to demonstrate gender identity, whether that's gender identity that's congruent or diverse gender identity. The second major thing to know is that people don't choose their gender, okay? And they can't be forced to change it. This is kind of a more old school thinking. Science doesn't support that. That's just simply untrue. So when a person tells you their gender, that is their gender. And so the final thing, and this is the thing that can be really difficult for educators sometimes, is that the words that humans use to communicate their gender identity, they change over time. They may not. Some people will use the same terms to communicate their gender identity throughout their lifetime. We know, though, that many people, especially gender nonconforming individuals, at young ages, some people may not have the vocabulary to communicate it because they just haven't been exposed to it yet. They also may or may not feel comfortable using certain terms at certain ages. And sometimes people use a term for a while and then learn of another term or realize that another vocabulary word better describes them. They identify more with it. So when we have people, whether children, adolescents, or adults, who let us know that they're using a different vocabulary term, different pronouns to identify, that is something that we should absolutely embrace and not question, because humans are dynamic in all aspects. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about language and gender, because we've been talking a lot about how it can change and that, we need to respect it, but what exactly is the language related to gender? First, like all language, it's continually evolving, right? And we have a lot more words now for this beautiful gender spectrum than we have had in the past. And so many of us are still learning what some of the terms mean and becoming comfortable with them. And honestly, some of us are still a little unsure of how and when to use terms and exactly what's appropriate for us to use and what's appropriate for just the person to self-identify with. So today we're going to go over a few terms. You could do an entire training just on language and gender. And so I would encourage you, if you would like to, and if you want to become more familiar with terms, I do have a list of resources at the end of this presentation that have a lot of free resources to help you, downloadables, handouts, things like that, to kind of just help with expanding your vocabulary related to gender. Okay. But at the very primary level, understanding and using appropriate pronouns and vocabulary is necessary for whoever we're working with, whether it's student, staff, family. We want to always make sure that we're respecting people. Okay, so these are our 4 terms we're going to review today. The first is cisgender. Many people shorten this to cis, and that's a person whose identity aligns with their assigned sex at birth. So if you remember a few minutes ago, we talked about gender congruence, and I used myself as an example. So I am cisgender because I am female and I identify as female, okay? I guess I should say I'm genetically female and I identify as female is how I would accurately say that. Sorry about that. So then the next term is transgender. The accepted term is trans. So transgender is the full term. Very few people really want to be referred to as transgender. Trans is much more accepted. So I would recommend using the term trans. And so there's kind of a broad umbrella definition, and that's a person whose gender identity differs from their sex at birth. So if you remember earlier when I referenced those stats, I told you that the stats included people who identify in different ways. So people who might be non-binary or gender fluid or gender expansive. All those kind of fell within that trans umbrella. And that is not always true. So while that's the broad definition of trans, and some people who are non-binary or gender non-conforming would also identify with the term trans, other people prefer not to be lumped into the trans category. And this is true of all categories, right? Other people prefer to use a different term. Okay, so the narrow definition of trans would be a person whose gender identity is opposite from the assigned sex at birth, right? So if I was born genetically female and identified as male, that would be considered trans. And there are a lot of vocabulary terms and identities that people use, even within trans. So as you meet people who are trans or gender nonconforming, if they use a term that you're unfamiliar with, I would recommend look it up. Or if you're in a situation and you feel like you know the person pretty well and you feel comfortable and you think they would feel comfortable, you can always ask them what that means. Okay, so that's cis and trans. We have agender as well. Agender is not always talked about, and I'm not sure why, but that's a person who sees themselves as not having a gender. So sometimes people will refer to themselves as gender neutral, sometimes agender. So that's another group to know about, another term, identity. And then the last one is non-binary. So a person whose gender identity is not exclusively masculine or feminine. All right, so let's talk a little bit about pronouns. There are a lot of pronouns. There's obviously she, her, hers, he, him, his. And then we have the they pronouns, they, them, theirs, right? But as a singular pronoun. And then there are other pronouns that people identify with as well, whether it's sie, zer, zers. There are different spellings. There's her, hers, if you see with HIR. This is definitely not exhaustive. These are some of the most common ones. So if you are talking with someone and they provide their pronouns to you and you're unfamiliar with them or feel like you may have misheard, definitely ask them to repeat it. And if you need to write it down, if you are like me, I always need to know how things are spelled so I can make sure that I have it correct. Definitely do that, and then make sure that you use the pronouns that the person has given you, and if you make a mistake, apologize, and then use the correct pronouns in that conversation with that person. Okay, one of the more common questions I get is it grammatically incorrect to use they? We are so used to hearing they as a plural pronoun that it sounds very different to many people whenever we hear they used to refer to a single person. The answer is no, it's not grammatically incorrect. It is completely acceptable, and it's not new. The Oxford English Dictionary uses singular they as far back as 1375. If you are an etymology person and you want to know the history of singular they, I do have a link there for you to check out some interesting facts about singular they. But if the only thing you take away from this is that it's been around as a singular pronoun since 1375, it's just a nice little thing to have in the back of your mind so that if people talk about, things these days or changes or all that, you can gently let them know that this is actually not new at all. Okay, so obviously we're talking a lot about terms and words, and we know that our words matter. You wouldn't be here if you weren't concerned or interested and you weren't already cognizant of this. So we want to make sure that we're communicating that our words matter by using our words in an inclusive way, right? So we want to model inclusive language. We want to have one-on-one conversations. We want to show through our language and our conversations that we understand, respect, and will maintain confidentiality. And we want to use gender-inclusive pronouns when we're writing, whenever possible, so that we can make sure we don't accidentally misgender a human being. And we're going to go into each of these a little bit more. Okay, so first, gender and gender pronouns are not a preference. If you remember back when we were talking about California guidance, the word preferred was in there, and I used that as an excerpt. However, gender, again, is not a preference. We can't change our gender, so it's not preferred pronouns. Many of us, as we were first learning to ask about pronouns, would say, oh, what are your preferred pronouns? Preferred pronouns, though, implies that the person actually has another set of pronouns, right? And they don't. We all have pronouns with which we identify, and then pronouns with which we do not identify. So it's very important that when you ask people what their name is and what their pronouns are, that you ask it like that. What are your pronouns? Okay, modeling inclusive language. This can be really intimidating. Thinking about how do I just go in and start modeling gender inclusivity in my day-to-day language. So let's talk about some of the easiest ways to do that and some quick updates or changes that you may or may not already be using that will model inclusive language. The first is using your pronouns in your email signature. Super quick and easy. You just go in to whatever email platform you're using and you add those pronouns at the end. I used mine as an example. If you'll notice, my pronouns are a different color. They are hyperlinked, and they are hyperlinked to a very short article that explains why do pronouns matter. I got this idea from a professor, a psychology professor at the University of Texas at Austin, who said that her entire department had started doing this as a way to provide education and make it available to anyone who receives their email could click on that hyperlink and see and learn a little bit about pronouns. Because it's hyperlinked in there, again, if you're interested in doing that, you would be able to access that link. You're also welcome to email me after this presentation if you want some links to some articles. There are a lot of great articles out there that are really short. I made sure that mine was really succinct, you in a good readability level so that anyone who reads would be able to kind of understand about pronouns. So you can also add it to your Zoom, which is really useful. Okay, the next thing is sharing your pronouns when you introduce yourself. This is a little bit harder. It definitely takes a little bit of practice, but we all introduce ourselves by name when we meet someone, right? You don't just, well, sometimes we walk up and start talking, but typically we share our names at some point early on in that conversation. There's no reason why we can't also share our pronouns when we make that introduction. And again, until you get used to it, it feels a little bit weird to say, hi, I'm Amy. I use she, her pronouns. And when you introduce yourself that way, some people will probably respond with their name and pronouns. Some people will probably respond with just their name. Some people might ask you why you did it. Some people may look surprised. But the more times that we do this, and the more people we do it around, the more normalized it becomes, right? And we're modeling this for other people. As you know, because you're all educational leaders, people need things modeled several times before they feel comfortable doing them. So it's a great idea to make a practice of sharing your pronouns in meetings. It's an easy way to get all school staff kind of accustomed to it, and you'd be surprised how quickly people will pick up on that and will start doing that themselves. And this is obviously important for several reasons. Not only are you sharing your name and your pronouns so people know how to reference you, you're also opening it for any person who may want to share pronouns but may feel awkward or unsure of an appropriate time to do that. And you're modeling inclusivity. Same with your email signature. Really, anytime you can include your pronouns, you are letting our gender diverse population know that you see them, that you recognize that pronouns are separate from assigned sex at birth, and it's a way of welcoming people to be who they are. So I would highly recommend that. Practice sharing your pronouns with each other. Practice using it as you interact with new people. I know some of us have limited interactions with new people, but it's a really useful skill, and it's pretty easy once you get in the habit. Okay, when we're talking with students, Again, conversations and confidentiality are key. So you want to ask your students their name and pronouns when you meet them, and you want to make sure that you're asking in a space that's safe for them, right? So you're probably not going to be asking in a huge group setting for each person to, or for one person to share their name and pronouns. And you want to make sure that you're leading by introducing yourself, like we talked about on the previous slide, with your name and pronouns, right? A lot of people ask me, what age is this appropriate? The answer is every age. If you remember, by age 4, most kids have a pretty stable sense of their gender identity. So while some of your kiddos who are cis, who are born, and their gender and their sex match, they may or may not be as aware. If you model it by using yours and they ask you a question, you can use an example that is first person centered. So, oh yeah, my name is Miss Amy. I use she, her pronouns. So if someone were telling a story about me, they would say, oh yes, I know Miss Amy. She went to the park last week. So if somebody were telling a story about you, what pronouns would they use? And so some kids, as in early elementary, may be a little unsure. Many kids get it and they'll be able to respond. Either way, again, it's good to honor every individual by asking them that question. Obviously, you only need to ask when you first meet them. And make sure that you take note of what they say, okay? And don't assume the student's pronouns. Make sure that you ask. And if a student is unable to answer the question, maybe they're young or they just don't understand, that's also okay. You can just let it go. If you've tried, you don't want to make it a stressful thing. If you have a student whose name and or pronouns are different than what you have on your records, you want to use follow-up questions to ask them how they should be referred to at school and at home, right? And this is beyond just students who are gender diverse. So I will again give a first person example. So I have a daughter who is currently in 8th grade, and at home she goes by Evie. She's been Evie since the day she was born, and she really likes going by that name at home. However, in 1st grade, we went to meet the teacher the day before school, and she walked up to her desk, and in kindergarten she had been Evie, and she looked at the Evie on the table, and she said, I don't want to be Evie at school, I want to be Evelyn. And that wonderful teacher relabeled all of the things on her desk and her, pencil can and her markers and all of that, relabeled it all with Evelyn. And ever since 1st grade, she has been Evelyn at school and Evie at home. And so that's an example of a person who uses very different names at school and home, and so it's useful to know that, right? And she would tell you, if you asked her, she would tell you, well, at home I'm Evie, at school I'm Evelyn. So we want to give every child that chance to let them know, because it shows that we care about them as people. It also gives them the opportunity to let us know kind of how they're identifying in different settings and who they're talking to and what names are being used to reference them. It also opens the door for possible conversation if a student wants to share something hard with you. Like, well, I would like to go by these pronouns at school, but in this certain class, I'm having a hard time because of X, Y, Z. It kind of allows for that conversation to naturally start. Okay, so we've talked about honoring your student, and we want to remember that not all students are going to feel comfortable sharing with us, right? Some students are not going to let us know if they are gender diverse and use different pronouns. They might not feel comfortable with us. They might not feel safe in the environment for whatever reason. They may not yet have the vocabulary to explain. And sometimes you may hear from another educator that a student is using different name or pronouns, and when you ask, they give you the name and pronouns on the records. We need to honor all of that. Every person has a right to share their personal information with whomever they choose, and so if a student gives you an answer that's unexpected, or you were really hoping to have a heart-to-heart with them, and they give you an answer that just indicates that they're not ready to talk with you, we need to honor their privacy. And because of that, there are a fair number of students who, for many reasons, might not feel comfortable or safe in sharing their pronouns. And because of that, when we're writing records, whether it's a report or just documentation or whatever it might be, we want to avoid gendered pronouns. It's better to try to use the student's name primarily, and when you do need to use pronouns, you can use they, them pronouns, because those are inclusive and non-gendered. So that's just an idea, and we're going to go into that a little bit more. Finally, I know we've discussed it, but I do just want to remind everyone that confidentiality is so important. So don't disclose confidential information about a student without their permission. And this can become really tricky when a student identifies in one way at home and in another way at school. And so we're going to talk through a little bit of how we can logistically avoid accidentally breaching a child's confidentiality. Okay, we know that each person makes a big difference, and each person works within a team, right? Especially in education, we have so many great team members that bring their strengths and unique perspectives. That also means that we have team members that come from a lot of backgrounds and with a lot of different skill sets, which is amazing. Sometimes teams need additional tools, especially for things like gender inclusivity and gender equity. We've found that surprisingly few school staff and educators have had explicit conversations about how to address gender diverse and gender non-conforming and trans students at school, and how to navigate situations. And a lot of educators, although they may know about using different pronouns, may or may not feel comfortable making pronouns and introductions part of routine in classes, or may not know how to have those one-to-one conversations. So if you already have staff trainings addressing these things, that's awesome. It's so important. If you don't, it's definitely worth looking into and developing and having some staff trainings, as well as easily accessible resources, right? Because we learn things in training and we're really excited, and then 2 weeks later we're like, ooh, what was that? And by a few months later, many times we cannot remember very much of what we've learned. We have a couple of key takeaways, and if you're like me, the PDF is then filed away with so many other PDFs on my desktop, and it's just very difficult to find it. So if you have a way to do centralized, easy to access resources, that can be really helpful for staff. As we discussed earlier when talking about introducing yourself with gender pronouns, giving people opportunities to practice is wonderful. Again, team meetings. You can just make it a practice that even though everyone knows each other, so that people get comfortable with it, everyone practices sharing their name and pronouns at the beginning of meetings. And other ways to just kind of organically work on it and practice using gender inclusive language. Finally, it's really important to have a district level plan so that you have something that is cohesive and consistent that you can let your staff know to reference that when they have questions, right, or when they don't know how to proceed. So all of those are just things to consider. You may have all of those things in place. You may have none of those things in place. So depending on where you are, you might have different action items. Here's an example of something that we did as we were making really accessible resources for our staff. When we first started making sure that we asked about gender and pronouns, I guess not gender and pronouns, when working with our students, we created this really simple script for our psychologists and BCBAs. And all of us are pretty familiar and comfortable with pronouns and using different pronouns. And even for us, many people on the team were a little nervous and not reluctant, but nervous and just a little apprehensive, I guess, about trying to ask students. And so we did have to have practice, and this script really helps because we put this at the beginning of our interview document for students that we're interviewing. And so you don't have to remember to ask, and you don't have to come up with the words to ask, right? It's already right there for you. And our team really liked this. Some people say that they still use it. Some people have kind of branched off, but it made it very easy for it to become a routine and automatic. So that's an example of one simple thing that you could do to help build in supports for your team. Okay, if you've been listening to the last couple of minutes and saying, we have none of this, I don't think my staff is very aware of gender inclusivity, and I think we could use a lot of growth in that area, you might consider advocating for some more gender inclusivity within your district. So first, definitely ask, right? Research the current district policies if you're not already familiar with them. Ask about any current trainings and practices that you have. I know especially in larger districts, sometimes it's hard to know all the trainings that are out there, and sometimes we may request a training and then find out that it's already being provided and we just didn't know about it. So see what's out there, and then if you do your research and you find out that there isn't a policy in place, or that it's not very comprehensive, and that there isn't any training, then advocate for some updated policies and processes at the district level. There are a lot of great models. There are some districts in California that have some really robust models. And there are a lot of different groups, such as Gender Spectrum, which I referenced earlier, and several others that have some sample plans and some things that schools can do. So those are just some things to consider. And then in talking about special education, when we think about students in special education and we think about the mountain of paperwork, which is now largely digital, right? But that comes with students in their records, in the assessment reports, we frequently get questions about this, because many times when a student begins their educational career, if they are a student who is gender nonconforming or trans, many times their pronouns change at some point during their educational career. And then the question becomes, how do we preserve that confidentiality? How do we ensure that previous records aren't sharing too much about the student, right? Sharing that they had a different gender that was assigned to them at birth, but is not who they are. And so different districts handle that in different ways. If you're not aware of how your district handles it, I would definitely ask around about that. There are some districts that have a policy that on student request, they actually retroactively change the student's name and or gender to the student's name and gender that they request, the one with which they identify. And so if you think about that, thinking about going back into old reports and trying to update gender. More often, gender is changed than name. Sometimes it's name and gender, but gender pronouns are a frequently more frequently requested for change. So thinking about the logistics of that and what that can look like, it's a bit of a daunting task. So it's a good time to review those things, see what the processes and policies are, and ask your school psych about evaluation processes and how they are handling gender when they are working with students and writing reports. And school psychs are great resources. Many school psychs are very well equipped and eager to help collaborate on things like staff training. So definitely check in with your school psychs if that's a need to see if they might be willing and able to help with that. But this does bring up a really interesting question, and that is, what do we do to ensure that we're not accidentally misgendering a child? So we know that many children who are gender nonconforming or trans may share with us different pronouns sometime during their educational career. We also know that not all students are going to share those with everyone at the same time. And unfortunately, we do still have a fair number of students whose families are not supportive of their gender identity. And so we often get the question, what do we do when the family is unsure or unsupportive and the student is clearly telling us that they would like a certain set of pronouns and the parents are not really on board with that? So that can cause a little bit of an issue, and we're going to talk about what we can do. At Psyched, we've decided to go to completely gender inclusive report writing. And what that means is that we use they, their for every student every time. Now, when we are working with a student, if the student tells us, they have she, her pronouns, usually you're not using a person's pronouns when you're interacting with them, right? Usually you're calling them by their name, but we would use the person's pronouns. But because we know that not all students are going to share their pronouns, and we know that some students' pronouns will change, rather than misgendering any human, we prefer to use gender inclusive pronouns so that any student, regardless of what their gender identity might be, could be seen and not misgendered in written reports. It also really helps whenever we are working with families who may not be supportive. We can just say we use gender inclusive pronouns in all of our reports. So it takes away the personal, well, no, if a family is giving pushback of that's not the way I want you to identify my child, use the gendered pronouns. If your student is, let's say, trans, we're able to say, oh, we do this every time to be inclusive. And so we rarely have families that have an issue with this because we use student's name most and then gender inclusive pronouns as needed. And the universal use of gender inclusive pronouns is usually a satisfactory explanation for people. We have occasional concerns that come up, mostly from case managers who are worried that parents will be upset. It's much rarer that our parents are actually upset. So I wanted to include one brief observation. This is just a sample of a gender inclusive observation that we might use in a report, because a lot of people ask us, well, do your reports become difficult to read? Is it clunky? Is it hard to understand? I don't think so, and I think that it's easiest to highlight that by reading aloud. As I read this aloud, note that there are no gendered pronouns, not for the student, not for the student's peer, who will be mentioned, not for the teacher even. So I'm going to read this. I'm going to refer to the student as X. X's teacher introduced new material to the class. X looked toward the teacher briefly and then turned to respond to a peer's comment. X smiled, laughed, and responded to their peer. A small matchbox car rested on X's desk, and X gave it to their peer. The peer pushed the car around briefly, then returned the car to X. During this time, X's teacher explained a group assignment. A student seated near X asked a clarifying question, and when the teacher came to the other student's desk and answered the question, X focused on the conversation between the other student and the teacher. So that's an example. It flows pretty well, and it's not, it doesn't sound awkward that it uses the they, but it also, again, takes away the chance of misgendering. Okay. I want to talk about a few frequently asked questions that we have related to gender inclusive writing specifically. And the first question, probably the most common question we get, is that if a student says that they use he or she pronouns, why wouldn't I just use those pronouns? So we kind of addressed that already, that, you know, if you were to use a pronoun when talking with the student, certainly you can use whichever ones they say, but in writing, it helps us make sure that we're not inadvertently misgendering the student, and also we have no idea what their future looks like. So if in the future, they identify with a different set of pronouns, we've used inclusive pronouns that would not misgender them or breach confidentiality. The next question we get a lot is what we should do for teachers and parents. People say, well, teachers and parents identify as male or female, which is not universally true. You know, we have gender diverse trans and non-binary adults, just like we do children and youth. And so what I always like to think of is, have I asked, right? Same principle that we talked about with the students. Have I asked the adult their pronouns? So did we go around the circle at the beginning of the meeting and I noted down everyone's pronouns? Like, did they share that with me? Did they send me an email that had pronouns at the end? If so, I have pronouns. Okay, if I want to use gendered pronouns with that person and they have shared them with me, I can absolutely do that. If, however, I have not asked that person their pronouns, I probably shouldn't be assuming what their pronouns are. So I would strongly suggest that if you're going to use pronouns that are gendered with a person, that you make sure that the person actually identifies with those pronouns. And if not, I think it's a good idea to use they, their. And you can always use inclusive pronouns like they, their for every human, every time. Okay. I don't know if this is so much a question as a complaint. People complain that this is hard. It's awkward, it's clunky, it takes extra time. I have to hit the backspace key 1,000 times when I write because I keep accidentally putting in gendered pronouns. This is really annoying. I hear that. It's difficult. Lots of new things are difficult. Nothing is automatic. I don't know about everyone else, but every single year in January, I write the previous year's date for probably halfway through February, right? And it gets better. And eventually, by halfway through the year, much earlier than that usually, I'm writing that year's date, right? And it becomes automatic. It's the same thing with this. It's going to be difficult at the beginning. I occasionally still struggle with it, or I have to think a little bit longer about the way I want to word something. But overall, it gets more automatic. And I think that the larger picture of making sure that we're honoring identities is worth the extra effort. Okay, final question that we often get from school staff. What do I do if my staff isn't on board? There have been concerns of teachers claiming that gender inclusive language limits their free exercise of religion. If you encounter this, you are in luck, I guess, in that there is very recent case law that can guide you. So in 2020, there was a federal ruling on an incident like this, and essentially a student identified as trans and was using a different name and pronouns. The school let all the staff know that they needed to refer to this student by the name and pronouns, and one teacher refused to do so, and eventually was let go by the school because the teacher refused to honor that student's identity. And so the teacher sued, and the court ruled in favor of the school. They found that school policies that require teachers to refer to students by the name and pronouns with which the student identifies does not target specific religious beliefs. So if you encounter any pushback from the staff, again, training and practice is really helpful for helping people feel comfortable. But if you get this question, know that no, it's not violating or targeting any specific religious beliefs to honor a human's identity. So those are the major high points of this. In this amount of time, it's difficult to really go in depth. So if you are interested in learning more, if you would like some additional actionable things that you can take away to do with your campus in meetings and in writing, if you would like some writing samples, I would encourage you to sign up for my next webinar, which is February 16th at 1 p.m. And we're going to go into this a little bit more. It's going to have a lot of application-based ideas for you, for what you can do to support gender inclusivity on your campus. If you don't feel like you need any more webinar training and you feel like you would like to consult with somebody on our team, or you're like, yes, staff training would be very helpful for us, we do that too. And we would love to partner with you in this. It's one of my favorite things to get to talk with people and learn where people are at and what things people are encountering and how they want to grow, and just support that comfort level growing as people learn to use language to support inclusivity. And this is the list of online resources that you can access for free that have a lot of different information and are really, really helpful as you're looking into gender inclusivity. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. I hope that you've learned a little bit, at least, about gender inclusivity, and that you came away with some ideas for how you might be able to support gender equity and gender inclusivity on your campuses and in your districts. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your